Je termine avec la même phrase que je répète depuis le début. Plus vite on va réduire les contacts physiques, plus on va réduire la contagion, plus on va sauver des vies, puis plus vite on va revenir à une vie normale. Donc, je vous remercie infiniment pour votre grande collaboration. Je compte sur vous et, comme le dit un organiste, là, ça va bien aller.
Little snippet of something you probably got very used to over the course of the pandemic. François Legault speaking to Quebecers. In fact, between January 2020 and September of this year, François Legault, get this, he spent around 21 hours and 15 minutes on TVs, on radio stations across the province, speaking directly to Quebecers about the virus. You heard some of that language just there. Je compte sur vous, right? I'm counting on you, right? Ça va bien aller. All of these words that he used. There's no question that, in fact, he benefited from this pandemic response. He gained in popularity over the pandemic. Let's take a look at the language that was used by the premier in order to get that increase in public favor over the pandemic. We're going to go now to Dr. Vincent Reynaud. He's an affiliate professor of communication studies at Université du Québec at Trois-Rivières, and he's an expert on political communication. Dr. Reynaud, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Hey, and I should point out, you've got some terrific academic chops. You also teach in Boston at Emerson College, so you're doing work on both sides of the border. It's very impressive. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
So you've looked at François Legault, the words he used, the language he's used. Tell me why he has been so successful as a communicator through this crisis.
Well, before we even look at the language, I think it's important to really understand the structure of how he's going about this crisis communication during the pandemic. So one thing that is really interesting is that politicians nowadays can be seen as being in a permanent campaign style approach to communication. So they're always campaigning, they're always keeping their eye on re-election or on election, and they really need to sort of keep that in mind. When it comes to Legault, what is interesting about his approach to the pandemic communication is that he really tried to personalize the communication style throughout the crisis, meaning that he really put a lot of emphasis on himself, but also on the team. And what is really important here is that messaging is always more credible when it's coming from a leader that is perceived as being trusted, as being close to the public, and as being engaged with the issue. So what is really interesting about what you saw throughout the pandemic is that Legault really sort of replicated a communication style that you saw during the 1998 ice storms, right? Where there was a lot of emphasis given on the leader of Quebec back then, but also on the team surrounding him. And Legault's doing the same thing with, for example, giving a lot of emphasis to Dr. Ruda, for example, or other members of his team to really reinforce the message.
So what you're saying there is that whole setup, just the look at it. When we're looking at our TV set and we're looking at the screen and we see Legault in the middle, but he's flanked by Arruda, by Dubé, that adds to the kind of trust we can put in the words coming out of his mouth?
Absolutely. It really portrays a full government response to the crisis, right? So other leaders, for example, have had some issues across the world when it comes to the pandemic response, because, for example, a lot of the attention was given to them personally. We saw that, for example, in Ontario with the Premier in Ontario having some issues at some point in his pandemic response. Legault has been really good at not only sort of portraying himself as in control of the situation, but also looping in all members of his team and making sure that the members of his team have great visibility in the media environment. And that really helps convey an approach and convey the image of a government that is in full control of the situation.
We're with Dr. Vincent Reynaud. He's an affiliate professor of communication studies at Université du Québec at Trois-Rivières. He's also an expert on political communication. And I know, Dr. Reynaud, that you have looked at a lot of leaders throughout this pandemic. Where would you rank François Legault amongst North American leaders?
Well, I think Legault is doing extremely well compared to other leaders, and I think the polls speak for themselves. You probably saw a couple of polls coming out in the past few weeks, and it shows that Legault is among the premiers that has performed the best during the pandemic in Canada. But I would say internationally as well, Legault is doing extremely well. So, I mean, Legault is doing well. And what is interesting as well about Legault is that, especially in the past few months, he's given a lot of emphasis to his successes, right? So there's been some aspects of the pandemic response that have been a bit more difficult on the part of the government when it comes, for example, the reopening of the schools, or when it comes to, for example, having all the long-term care living, houses being staffed up correctly. So there's been some issues when it comes to the pandemic response, but Legault has always been able to put a lot of emphasis on the success stories of his pandemic response.
So let's get to the language now, the words that were used. What sticks out at you amongst the phrases, the terms, the words that François Legault used to get his message across?
Absolutely. So what is really interesting, there's this really interesting article that came out in La Presse about this specific issue of word use, is I think what is interesting about the Legault response is that he's been really able to sort of reuse the same words throughout the pandemic. So what is interesting about this is that when you're reusing the same words and when you're sort of creating a language around the pandemic, you're essentially controlling the conversation of the pandemic. So this is why you saw Legault using, for example, the expression "Ça va bien aller," which you heard numerous times. It was actually able to create this slogan that really rallied the Quebec around the pandemic response. Something that in the more academic literature we call it rally around the flag, right? So making sure that people are united behind the government. So this is how you do this: is you really come up with certain words or certain expressions that will really get people behind the pandemic response. And I think Legault has been really great at using this approach to build support around his pandemic response, and most likely it will serve him well when it comes time for re-election in the not too distant future.
Does he deserve some credit for his use of language in stopping, for getting Quebecers on board with vaccinations and perhaps for stopping conspiracy theories? We've seen in other places conspiracy theories and that kind of stuff and the anti-vaxxer movement to be much bigger than it is here. Does he deserve any of the credit for that?
I wouldn't say he deserves credit, but I think he deserves credit for really creating a conversation that was really positive and that really helped rally people around, first of all, all the things that we needed to do during the pandemic, which is, social distancing, hand washing, mask wearing, but it really translated well when it comes to the vaccination numbers in Quebec as well. But what I really find interesting about the conspiracy theories in Quebec is I really do believe that the rise of these more conspiracy movements have actually been helpful to Legault. Because oftentimes in the government, you need to sort of rally people behind and really fight something specific, right? So I think that the conspiracy theory forces, for example, in Quebec, have really provided Legault with another sort of cause or a certain issue that helped him rally people around him and around his team.
I got a minute to wrap up here, Dr. Reynaud. So let me just ask you about Justin Trudeau, the federal side. Any thoughts on how Justin Trudeau handled language and talking to people during the pandemic?
Sure. Trudeau had a completely different approach to Legault, because really Trudeau made it about really put a lot of emphasis on himself, right? So a lot of for example, throughout the pandemic, in the early days of the pandemic, there was a lot of emphasis on Trudeau himself. He was running, for example, the press conferences alone. So that really changed a little bit the dynamic, and this is why, when it came to the federal elections, a lot of the pandemic response was really around Trudeau, and a lot of the criticism was around Trudeau. But I think Trudeau had a completely different approach, but to some degree it served him well. And I'm really interested to see how Trudeau is going to be pushing forward, because at this point, there needs to be a lot more conversations about vaccines and about, the reopening of Canada. So it's going to be really interesting to see how Trudeau handles this and how he builds his message in the next few months.
Dr. Reynaud, really fascinating analysis. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I think your students are very fortunate to have you as a professor. Thanks for coming on.
Well, I appreciate it, and have a great morning.
That's Dr. Vincent Reynaud. He's an affiliate professor of communication studies at Université du Québec at Trois-Rivières. He's also an expert on political communication.